Delighted to welcome this esteemed panel here today to talk about something which affects all of us and something which I'm sure you're going to get quite riled about, judging by the backstage conversation. We're talking about homes for everyone and, of course, for nature too. Please would you give a warm hey welcome to Chris Packham, Rosie Pearson, Kevin McCloud and Sarah Lamptey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Lamptey. It's a true privilege to be here with such a brilliant panel and to see all of you here this morning. I'm joined, as you know, by designer, author, and Grand Designs presenter, Kevin McCloud.
Thank you. Hello.
We also have wildlife TV presenter, conservationist, and author Chris Packham. And the fantastic founder of the Community Planning Alliance, Rosie Pearson. And as you know, we'll be taking a look at how we must tackle the country's housing crisis without sacrificing our beloved and vital countryside. My name is Sarah Lamptey, as I said. Who am I? You definitely know who they are, but probably don't know who I am. So I founded a homelessness charity in 2018 called Showerbox. And what we do is we give showers to anyone who needs a shower. So that tends to be people living on the street. So of course, very pertinent to what we're talking about today. We are working to support both their physical health, but of course, their emotional wellness, and around 250 people every Saturday join us at just our Central London project alone. It grows 25% year on year, and the need is extreme. So as a result, I'm particularly excited to be talking to such a heavyweight panel and hearing all your guidance and all your advice. So let's get going. Rosie, I'm going to start with you about the background to the incredibly important Homes for Everyone report, and just give us a little bit of some background about why it's so very needed.
Well, really nice to be here. First time at the Hay Festival, really exciting. We all know there's a housing crisis. We're told that day in, day out in the press. But what is that housing crisis? Is it a crisis for foreign investors that want to buy flats off plan in Manchester to leave empty? No, it's not. Is it a crisis people want a second home in the countryside? No, it's not. The real crisis, as Sarah just mentioned, is the record number of children in temporary accommodation. I think it was 150,000 last year. The highest number of people on a housing waiting list in London ever. Housing waiting lists across the country that sit there and don't shift downwards. So that's the crisis, and that's for people that will never be able to get onto the housing ladder to buy, or possibly even to rent in the market. So that is the actual housing crisis, and it's not one that government is dealing with. Then on top of that, you've got other crises. You've got a massive nature crisis. You've got sort of free-falling bird populations, insect, butterfly populations, major problems. We've got a food and farming crisis, probably more so with the climate crisis. And we have the climate crisis with the current housing plans for over 300,000 homes a year. If they're on greenfield, that will burst and break our carbon budget altogether, because it's concrete, it's cars, it's tarmac. It's just the wrong way to do things. And we've probably got a water and sewage crisis on top of that. So what you can't do is look at a housing crisis in isolation. You have to look at the big picture and have some joined up thinking. And what you can't do is set a 1.5 million home target over the life of Parliament and leave it all to the private sector to try and solve it, because they will never, and nor should they really, they're about profits, they will never build social housing, and they won't help those children on the waiting list or in temporary accommodation. So there's a major, major problem here. And what we're saying as a group is that, taking all that into account altogether, we don't want to see green space built on unnecessarily. If you look at all the different surveys and polls, the British public loves nature, loves our countryside. It comes out after the NHS in loads of polls as the most important thing to our nation. And there is a way that you can solve the housing crisis without trashing nature, farmland, countryside. And that's all the stats I've got behind me on the screen. There are around 3.5 million units, sort of dwellings, you could call it, that you could use before you build on any green belt, countryside, farmland, whatever the labels are you choose to use. There's over 1.2 million brownfield homes, probably more, because that depends on the counting by local authorities. There's over 1 million empty homes that could be brought back into use. There's thousands of commercial properties and public sector properties that you can convert into homes. There's spare rooms in people's houses, and I know Chris and I were talking about that, and it's not everyone's cup of tea to share a room or to have a lodger, but it does work for some people, and we're not saying everyone should share their room, but it's a nice way of making money. My sister actually has a lodger. He's a 21-year-old. It's his first job away from home. Perfect for him because he has a nice, safe environment that feels a bit like a home. And for my sister, it's a bit of pocket money, and she gets the company. So they're choosing that. I completely accept. I'm not sure I particularly want a lodger. I'm a bit antisocial, but it's there as an option. And anyway, there are 26 million spare rooms, so even if a small fraction of those are taken up, that's a great start for some people. Then you've got all the unbuilt planning permissions you read about all the time, around about 1.4 million at the moment, and that is house builders sitting on land, which I know Kevin and Chris might talk about more later. And then we're also saying that actually the density we're building at the moment across the UK is far too low, and that results in a massive land take. Again, we're not saying build in tower blocks, which a lot of people think when you talk about density. We're saying do it like the Continentals do, or like Bath, the Crescents, or townhouses or terraces with lots of common green space that people can play in. So we're not talking about rabbit hutches, we're not talking about no green space, and we're not talking about high rises. So there's really good ways of doing this. So we want to see greater density. Before I stop this section, our government has said that 150,000 hectares of countryside will be under concrete by 2050 with their plans. It's approximately 6 Birminghams, and that doesn't need to happen. Our Homes for Everyone approach shows, as I said, 3.5 million available properties that you could bring into use before you destroy countryside. So, rapid overview.
Thank you, Rosie. That was a brilliant overview. A brilliant overview, a hopeful one, and the fact that you have the solutions are here. They're right under our noses. And Chris, you said we need the right houses, built in the right way, put in the right place. So I hoped you could talk us through these 3 parts and how straightforward they are to achieve.
Yeah, okay. Before I start, I think I'll just put my cards on the table. The reason I got up at 5 o'clock this morning.
Oh.
Not sure your microphone's working.
Hello.
Sorry.
My microphone is...
Oh, she's just going to have a little look about that.
Okay.
Do you know, perhaps...
Let me fiddle with my bottom.
You have a fiddle with your
I won't
bottom.
offer to do that.
I'll tell you what, Sarah, shall I play the video quickly? Sarah, shall I play the video while we do that?
Oh, I think we're okay, actually.
Right.
Does that work?
Can you hear me now? Yes. Excellent, okay. I'm just going to put my cards on the table. The reason I got up at 5 o'clock this morning to travel here is that I believe, through my researches, that we don't need to take up a single hectare of what remains of one of the most nature-depleted set of nations anywhere in the world. I love life, everything that crawls, slithers, slimes, flies, or stings. And at this point in time, I'm going to devote whatever energies I have left in my life to protect that. And I'm not alone. I imagine a large number of you feel exactly the same way. I also acknowledge there is a housing crisis. You wouldn't want to share a room or indeed any part of a house with me unless you're a black miniature poodle. But nevertheless, through speaking to Rosie and Kevin, we have a full understanding of why we do not have to compromise nature to build, and we don't have to further threaten the environment. At the moment, if we build 1.5 million new homes, that takes up our entire carbon budget. That means that Ed Miliband is never going to balance the books. That's just on housing. So when I hear from Rosie that all of those stats which are written on the slide there, and I see that there are alternatives, it's imperative that we explore those, not building masses of homes that we don't need, basically to drive economic growth, which is what this government definitely wants to do, through a sector which is the most greedy bunch of capitalists that you could ever come across anywhere. The housing crisis is one of affordability. That's the problem. It's not planning, as the government would say. We'll move on to newts and bats pretty shortly. But the fact of the matter is, it's affordability. People can't afford their homes. There are all sorts of long and detailed reasons for this. It doesn't help that 1% of the population own 50% of the land in the UK, and therefore land prices are extraordinarily high here, and certainly higher than most other parts of Western Europe. So there is that question of if we have to build homes, what are they? Well, I'm sure Kevin will come on to the fact that we're living in the 21st century. We have the capacity to build homes which are 80 or 90% self-sufficient. We're still building houses with the lowest mandatory requirements for insulation, again, anywhere in Western Europe, in an energy crisis where people can't afford to heat their homes. And this because our dear friend David Cameron cut the green crap and stopped those rounds of subsidising people insulating their homes properly so that they weren't pouring heat through them. What's the point of building new homes if people can't afford to heat them? And it plays into this idea that we don't have energy security. So building the right type of house, Kevin's expertise, I'll defer to him on that, and putting it in the right place at the right price, i.e. affordable, is what we need to do, but not at the expense of nature. Because whether you love bugs and everything that creeps, crawls, slimes and stings is irrelevant. Many of you during COVID would have found that you found respite and solace in that green space, which you were allowed to visit for an hour a day. It may have got you through that tragic crisis. And therefore, we understand that it's about having access to those spaces, you know, particularly in dense housing situations, that's incredibly important. We have the capacity to do all of this. Why are we tolerating a government that's hell-bent on doing something which is enormously destructive, impossible when it comes to meeting our carbon budget delivery plan, and dangerous to the things that we love most, our quality of life and the nature that provides it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical. And so following on from what Chris has said then, Kevin, you talked about the UK as being a world leader in homelessness. So can you talk a little bit about
we
about
can't
that
claim
quote?
to be leaders in many things, but
No.
I mean, homelessness has more or less doubled across the country since 2010. It's tripled more or less in London since 2010. Yeah. And I want to put, following on from everything Rosie and Chris have just said, and by the way, listening to both of you, I felt my sort of, you know, I was feeling my sort of heart explode kind of slowly, because it's, I can hardly speak about this. I find the position that we're trying to adopt, the position that we want to take, the position that we should be taking, to me is so obvious, it's so principled, it's so human, and yet by the same token we seem to vote in government after government which drives really, really poor policy. And I come back to a point actually we made earlier in conversation, that it costs the government no more money to enact really well-drafted, properly thought-through legislation than it does to enact crap legislation. It's the same cost to that government. So why do governments do it? And the answer is, well, we have a political system, of course, which is prone to an enormous quantity of lobbying. We live in a country, just by way of background here, we live in a country which is one of the most populous in Europe. I think we vie more or less with if you exclude places like Monaco and the Vatican City, we live in one of the most populous countries in England. Holland is another, and that's my microphone playing up. Holland is another, and we sort of vie with them. And our approaches to housing are so very different. I remain an optimist about this, despite the rewinding of policy around construction and building performance over the past, should we say 15 years since the last Labour government, the total abandonment of net zero and of the Code for Sustainable Homes in my world, and a refusal to look to Europe to find the best examples of great practice. And that, I think, is where we can look. Everything we need to do already exists. You can visit zero energy projects. You can visit higher density schemes where people have much higher levels of social connectivity and social sustainability. You can visit schemes with fantastic biodiversity that improve the quality of life for so many species, not just us, and including us. So I'm a big advocate of one planet living for this reason. And only because, you know, when we talk about biodiversity, we somehow treat the rest of the biosphere as separate and distinct from us, whereas we are just a species, among others. And I think that refusal to change that mindset underscores so much, and it helps you understand so much of what comes out of central government in the UK. So I'm like these guys, I've just basically just listed my pet concerns here. You know, and I just want to say that it's we'll get onto it later, really, the kind of ways in which we can build and we can make our world and we can adjust it in such a way as to not simply accommodate, but as Chris says, finally, celebrate every species around us as well.
Yeah. And what a difference it would make if the leaders did adopt that view. If we are just one species, we're all, if that was actually the viewpoint of our leaders, we'd be in a very different situation. So as someone who's witnessed the evolution of architecture and sustainable design over the years, of course, Kevin, what do you believe is the most pressing challenge when it comes to making homes and buildings more climate friendly, and how can we overcome it on a larger scale?
Okay, so as a result of the planning system that we've inherited since 1947, which restricted development, some would say appropriately, and because of the populous nature of our country, there's been a huge restriction on land. And what has emerged from that is an industry, which is a house-building industry, which compared to, say, Austria, where over 80% of new homes are either custom-built or self-built, and there are thousands of builders, we have effectively a market which is controlled by 3 companies. Now that effective monopoly, and by the way, the House of Lords Select Committee said that there was evidence of a cartel operation between them. This was last year. That effective cartel of 3 operators is a huge lobbying power in government. And it also is a huge power on the delivery across the market. So if we want to buy a house these days, we would buy from probably, one of the large 3. I can name them. Probably all heard of them. Barratt, Taylor Wimpey, Persimmon. The largest of which, Persimmon, I think 2022, turned over £4.4 billion, not million, billion pounds, and made 25% gross profit. 1.1 billion pounds. That's going into the pockets of shareholders, okay? Maybe your pension funds, I'm sorry to say, but shareholders. Now, it's a fantastic capitalist model. It emerged as a result of a planning system which was never designed to facilitate capitalism, but did so. Yeah. And it's corrosive. It's hollowed out. These companies survive on a minimum overhead. They make maximum profits. And just, if you don't believe me, there's a wonderful piece of research from the Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is a combination of, it's a multi-university resource. And some researchers went out and they looked at all the public records of the housing companies, the big ones, over 15 years. And over 15 years, they saw that, on the whole, their profits never dipped below 17%, were generally around about up to 32%, generally hovering somewhere in between. So this is billions of pounds of money leaving the sector. This is our money, by the way. When we buy a house, this is where the cash goes back to those shareholders. And the most staggering thing of all is that these companies have such a control over the delivery market that they can control the supply chain, control land prices. They bank land, of course. We'll come on to that as an iniquitous activity. And what they've done is shift their focus. Now, we heard Rachel Reeves in the autumn statement last year say, whatever it is. I don't even pay attention to the numbers anymore because Kate Barker in 2004 produced a report for Gordon Brown saying it was 3.5 million homes, right? It doesn't matter what number the politicians come up with. The house building industry will fail to deliver it deliberately because if it delivers, then it's meeting demand and that actually reduces the price of the product. It's not what they want. What they want to do is to drip feed, phase their schemes, control the delivery of housing to push prices up. It's a seller's market. And that process and that shift away from government over the 15-year period, it's now nearly 20, by the way, that shift in focus has meant that on the average home that these builders build, from flats to 3 5-bedroom homes, the average profit, going back to that company for shareholders, has improved, despite the fact that their building costs and their land values have remained the same. The average profit has gone from about £6,500 per home to £65,000 per home. So when we talk about affordability, you can see immediately how, as long as that market delivery model is allowed to exist, we will never achieve it, ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, Rosie, if you would add anything about the correlation between the number of houses built and the house prices from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, to add to what Kevin's saying, the industry is protected in planning guidance so that their profit can't drop below 15%, but usually they'll argue for 20%. And that's what they'll be showing the council planners. They'll actually have a different viability appraisal which shows they're up to 30% profit. But these are the companies making huge profits, 65,000 per unit or per house, but coming back to the councils time and time again and claiming we can't make the scheme viable, we need to cut our affordable housing percentage. As a slight aside, that housing isn't affordable anyway. It's 20% below market value on new build house prices are higher anyway than the second-hand homes in the market. So affordable housing isn't affordable, and developers, despite their sky-high margins protected by the planning system, are actually not delivering anyway. And then, a slight aside, the new planning and infrastructure bill, which I think Chris will talk about in a minute, will allow developers to trash nature. They have to pay a fund to replace nature somewhere else. But the key point there is they only pay as much money as they can to keep their scheme viable. So what you'll have is developers needing to pay, say, $1 million, but they'll go, oh, sorry, we can't do that because the scheme's not viable, pay $500,000 instead. So nature just comes under developer viability. And I think that government gets really confused. They think the private sector will solve the housing crisis. They set a 1.5 million target, or whatever the target is. The target is meaningless, as Kevin said. It's never going to be delivered because developers operate on a margins over volume model. They will stop building the minute their profits start dropping. And there's a rule of thumb that all the house builders know that it tends to be on one outlet, they'll build 50 homes a year, and that's just across the board, most of the house builders. So you will never get the numbers that Labour wants. And the only time we've got near the 300,000 a year is when we were building social housing back sort of 20, 30 years ago. So if they want to get the numbers, they need to have a social house building target within their full target, and they need to fund it. It's the only way they can do it.
I've got a fun fact here.
Yeah.
Go on, fun fact.
The year in which we built the largest number of social housing homes, which at that time there was a culture of rental across the market where there was no stigma about living in a social housing home. That year was 1953, and it was under a Conservative government when I think we built nearly 200,000 homes.
And now we're building about 12,000, but we lose more through the right to buy. So we're below replacement level.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, Rosie, I just found it absolutely maddening about the definition of grey belt and the fact that the environment seems to be hinging on this classification. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. First, I'm going to try and play a video. I'm quite scared of technology in these situations. But this is Keir Starmer last year before he got elected saying that no countryside will get built on. So see if
brownfield first. So where there are brownfield sites, and then Nightingale Quarter is a brownfield site. There are others in and around Derby and Derbyshire that are brownfield sites. So that comes first. If there isn't enough brownfield, then we're not going to build all over the countryside. That's a nonsense, of course. Nobody wants to do that. If you look at the countryside in Derbyshire, it is fantastic. But within that, within the green belt, you do get pockets of what I call the grey belt. This is classically disused car parks, old petrol stations, industrial sites, and you can, I think, and should be able to build on those sorts of areas. Nobody's talking about building on the countryside. That has to be preserved, of course. But I was looking at an example the other day where there was literally a car park that was within the green belt, a playing field which was technically outside the green belt, and the proposal was to go ahead and build on the playing field, not the car park. I don't think that makes sense.
So, personally, I live in East Anglia, and it's absolute rubbish that greenfield countryside is not being built on. I mean, I was even driving here, actually, all you see is these orange, identikit, car-dependent, sprawling developments outside villages and towns. So, it's nonsense. So, the green belt, basically, was designed to stop cities sprawling, and it's sort of the green lung for people living in these cities. And the grey belt definition, when you hear about it there, you think, yeah, why shouldn't we build on a petrol station or sort of disused land? That's actually brownfield land, that's not grey belt. And of all the appeals that are going through and all the planning permissions granted on grey belt since this new rule came into play, most of it is greenfield on the edge of villages that are scraped through, because the rules, they're not about brownfield, they're not about disused sites. It's all to do with sort of very technical, I won't bore you with, but technical rules about the grey belt. The planners, the developers are using those. They're getting lots of permissions on grey belt. So it is countryside that will get the planning permission. I actually believe that those sites might well not be built on, because we talked about the sort of the builders not wanting to build out the numbers, but they will then land bank those extra grey belt sites. So if anyone says to you grey belt is an old petrol station, it's not. Most of it's countryside at the moment.
And how are they defining it grey belt then? They talk about sort of degraded green belt. What determines?
It's not even degraded, so
Right.
It's all about not affecting the openness of the countryside, which the green belt is supposed to help with, and sort of not impacting sprawl. But there's tenuous things around at the moment. They're saying that green belt only protects a town, but not the villages within the green belt around that town. So if you've got village A in the green belt outside the town that has the sort of official green belt designation, it doesn't matter. You don't protect that village from sprawl. You just protect the town from sprawl. So it's very tenuous, and it's not about previously used land.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've heard the definition regreening. I wanted to ask you, Chris, about sort of expanding on that, about what can we do, how straightforward, I suppose, is regreening in this context.
Well, thank you. Yeah, before we move on, I'd just say, Keir Starmer's got form when it comes to saying we're not going to build on the countryside. I've got a quote here. This was something that he allegedly said, because the Labour Party have said he did not say these words. But he was speaking to Ed Miliband, a gentleman that I think many of us have got a lot of time for when it comes to, significantly making improvements with our environmental commitment. And he said this, he was more interested in creating sustainable new jobs to replace jobs in old sectors that were being lost. He said that he was not interested in tree huggers, before adding to everyone's surprise, in fact, I hate tree huggers. So we've got a Prime Minister that hates tree huggers. Who are tree huggers? Hands up if you're a tree hugger.
I do find that trees don't like being hugged, but they have a big protective bark, but they certainly respond to care.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and sorry, just quickly on that, the whole rhetoric coming out of government at the moment, sort of anti-bat, anti-newt, anti-kitty rate, anti-spider, anti-everything, and that's why I've got Team Bat, Team Newt t-shirt on, because someone has to stand up for bats and newts and trees.
well, again, at the turn of the year, you won't have noticed that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer started a sort of a culture war on newts and bats. And they chose newts and bats as sort of totemic symbols, because these animals are obviously afforded legal protection. It was legal protection that we took on board from the Habitats Directive, a piece of European legislation that we nevertheless kept after our departure, Brexit and all of that. But yes, it was all about, newts and bats were the biggest problem, because they were stopping planning applications, the success of those planning applications. And then Starmer went on. He couldn't stop at newts and bats, and this was one that really excited us all, because in March of this year, he said that the government had bought some land in Kent, Ebbsfleet, where there was the dream of home ownership for thousands of families, but it had been held back by arachnids. Arachnids. I like the technical definition there. What he was talking about was an animal called the distinguished jumping spider. And what he was actually talking about was a site that they wanted to build more than 15,000 new homes. And his implication was that none had been built at all. I can tell you 4,000 have been built already, and thousands more will be built. 1,300 will not, because Natural England had by this stage designated part of that land as a site of special scientific interest, not just down to arachnids, but to the other wildlife that was there. And what you've got to think is, of those thousands of new houses that have been built, they will have an SSSI on their doorstep. And I would have liked that as a young man, and I'd have been out there down on my hands and knees looking, Keir, for the distinguished jumping spider. The fact of the matter is that when we drill down into it, as members of the Bat Conservation Trust did, how many of these planning applications are actually being stopped by newts and bats? Well, this is Natural England, the government's own statutory body, and they've said, through Freedom of Information request, out of the tens of thousands of planning applications that were consulted on each year, 99% result in Natural England developers finding ways for development to proceed whilst protecting nature. A mere 1% result in an objection. Why has the Chancellor, why has the Prime Minister, why has now the Deputy Prime Minister started a war on newts and bats if only 1% of those applications are in any way involving considerations around newts and bats, and a tiny percentage of the 1% actually result in the developers having to instigate any mitigation? It's bonkers. We love newts and bats. Why pick a fight with the nation of animal lovers and use them as symbols of the devilry when it comes to planning applications? It makes no sense whatsoever. It makes also no sense to trust the developers to put that mitigation in place. And I can tell you that because naturally, we at Wild Justice, that's Mark Avery at the time, who's retired subsequently, and Ruth Tingo and myself commissioned a report from the University of Sheffield. And what we did was we asked people to go around to housing developments where mitigation measures had been demanded. So they would have to put in X number of bat boxes, hedgerows, wildflower meadows, ponds, etc., etc. The headlines. A survey of nearly 6,000 houses across 42 developments found that only half of the promises to mitigate harm from nature had been kept. Many ecological enhancements had simply not materialised. 83% of hedgehog highways, 100% of bug boxes, and 75% of both bat and bird boxes were missing from these new developments. The delivery at plant life across the sites painted a very depressing picture. 39% of the trees detailed on planting plans were missing or dead, and only half the number of native hedges that were supposed to be laid existed. The developers just lied. They took the money, the 65,000, and they couldn't even be bothered because of some marginal profit issue to put in a bat box or a blasted bird box. This is where we're at.
Yeah.
So what's happened is that the government have come up with this piece of legislation which is going through at the moment called the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And part 3 of it is entirely devoted to how they're going to deal with the newts and bats in the situation. And they've come up with something called the Nature Restoration Fund, which Rosie's touched upon. The idea here being essentially that developers, I'll paraphrase it and simplify it and probably exaggerate it, but developers will be able to destroy nature to an agreed pound value, and that pound value will be essentially monitored by Natural England, that statutory body, which, by the way, has been cut, and is going through another round of redundancies at the moment. So unless there's significant reinvestment in that department where it would be able to do the job, they will be responsible for the implementation of the Nature Restoration Fund. And then that money will be given to fix nature somewhere else. So in really simple terms, a developer can say, I need to cut down this glade of ancient oak trees, and someone will say, wow, that's about £30,000, £30,000. And then hopefully, if Natural England have got anyone left there employed, they will be responsible for saying, wow, we're going to plant some oak trees. Do you know what? They don't even have to plant them in the same county. You don't even have to plant them in the same county. The Nature Restoration Fund is a con. It's a complete con. It's licensed to destroy nature and not have it mitigated in any way, shape or form. And that's why at the moment we have to take some stance against that. I'm very pleased to say that this week the ENGOs, RSPB, Woodland Trust and notably the Wildlife Trust have finally got a bit cross and have stood up and said they're not happy with this. Yeah. And they've got 2 million members. Some of those 2 million members, rather like myself, will be the sorts of people that are going to chain themselves to those oak trees. Yeah. So I do not understand why, given all of Rosie's stats here, this government is picking on newts and bats and basically saying that we can re-green other areas of other counties at the expense of destroying nature on people's doorsteps or forthcoming doorsteps. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I wanted to ask Kevin, obviously what we've heard from Chris, it feels bleak and desperate, and I'm so glad that there are brilliant people like you that are doing so much to affect change. I wanted to ask you, Kevin, though, backstage we actually had a positive moment that you shared since you wrapped the Great Climate Fight. Thankfully, there has been a brilliant development, so please share that with everyone.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a tiny win, but it's a tiny win. first of all, I'm just listening to one thing in describing, listening to Chris talk about government policy and the new climate and infrastructure bill, and the extraordinary way in which we look, again, it comes back to that earlier point I made about species, about looking at everything else as being a problem. And I was involved in development. I had, in a business which for 15 years we built houses, and we built housing schemes with local authorities and with social housing organisations. And we would anticipate that there would always be hedgehogs, badgers, bats, dormice, arachnids, you know. We just anticipate it. And so we started with our architects designing, before anything else, designing public realm. And we would put in as much shared amenity as possible, shared vegetable growing, shared orchards, shared beekeeping, shared wildflower meadows with a bike path through them, in the ownership and the stewardship of residents. And one thing that it comes back, another point.
Responsibility for the
absolutely. Well, it's just that, it's empowerment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Chris talked about the problem about the way in which developers kind of play down the requirements and save money and deliver very poorly against the objectives set by local authorities through the planning process, knowing full well that the planners, like English nature, natural England, are poorly resourced. So the great irony here is that everything we're talking about in terms of development and housing happens in what is also called the public realm. It is the spaces in between houses. It's the gardens and the streams and the small little runnels and the way that water is managed across the side. It's the swift boxes on the roof. It's the bee boxes. It's the bat boxes. It's the community orchard. It's these spaces which are absolutely missing from your standard offering. They are not there. And yet it costs so little to do. I'm very mindful that when people build these days, they talk about the need for space. I need a spacious room. They don't talk about connection. They don't talk about even ownership of connection. Having that view, having that amazing piece of biodiversity outside your window. We build these houses on single plots with 4 walls, which is the most inefficient way to build them in terms of the thermal loss. We build them around the country, giving everybody their little fiefdom. We build them out of town so that everybody has to buy at least 2 cars in order to be able to get around and go and get a pint of milk. We don't build for biodiversity. We don't build for nature. What it's possible to, and you can see this, you can see this actually in this little brochure from the Architects Journal, which is 20 examples of really wonderful projects in the UK. You see it all over Europe. You see it in Denmark. You see it in Switzerland. You see it in any European country. You can go and visit schemes which are either low car use or even 0 car use in some cases, where the houses are built to extremely high standards. So energy bills are next to nothing, where for that matter, if you monitor your home and you take responsibility for it, you get a reduced interest rate on your mortgage because the data from your meter is then fed back. How cool is that, you know? Where people have more money for the quality of life, more resource for the quality of life. They live in homes which are super cheap to run and which are fairly densely built. So they might be in a terrace or semi-detached, or they might live in a large apartment. But there is that diversity of offer that we do not have here. A diversity of tenure, so they might be rent-to-home buy, or they might be part of a co-housing group, or they might be owners, or they might be renting from a housing association. Whatever it is, there's a diversity of offer. And there is there also, in those schemes, built because at higher density for the same number of people that we accommodate on a much larger piece of land, there is within that also opportunities for shared amenity, growing food together, looking after the bees, enjoying the orchard together, maybe through a small micro-regeneration scheme that actually everybody collectively owns to get solar power into their homes. What strikes me as so missing, and it's missing in legislation, is that you can build an eco-home, you can call it that, but in Britain, anybody can move into that house and control the temperature by turning the heating up to full and then opening the window. Yeah. We don't assume that somehow community and people share any kind of responsibility in this, or any desire to share that responsibility. And my point is, give people these amazing shared amenities, reduce the garden size a little bit, perhaps, and all of a sudden, that respect for the wildlife, for biodiversity on that site doesn't diminish over time, it grows.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we are hurtling towards the questions, so I'm going to ask a few more questions here, and then the floor will be yours. I wanted to ask you, Kevin, who stands out over your Grand Design's time, the last 25 years, as building the right house in the right way?
It has to be the housing co-op, which was the Hedgehog Housing Cooperative from 1999, I think the series went out. And I went back in 2013, 2014, and these were people from the social housing list who were built using the Walter Siegel method, and they learned from each other, they learned skills, they empowered themselves. Interestingly, because they were earning through sweat equity, that is, they were working, building each other's homes, and therefore they got a cheap rent. As a result of that, over the years, they found that they didn't need to have full-time jobs to pay their huge mortgages. Incredible. So they end up running a local library or volunteering or becoming a counsellor or doing something actually that puts back energy into the community. And of course, all their kids, they were from the social housing sector, these people, so living in threatened accommodation. And their kids are now all off doing kind of university courses, becoming photographers and going off on gap years, That's how empowering the kind of... And that was all within one big shared space. And I thought we would be doing one of those every single series for the last 25 years, and we found one other. Yeah. Because they are so... I found others, but they just didn't take off, and they're so hard to get right.
And I was going to ask you, why are they so hard to get right? Why do you think it hasn't been more generally successful? Because that one was such a success story.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, in Europe, because of the diversity of offering and the supply chain in the housing market, that means that there are many more different types of organizations. So there are co-housing groups, and there are local authorities promoting that, who've got skilled staff who've done it before. There's a real proper culture of that diversity of offer. And we don't have that. So I went to visit a scheme in York, and we thought that was going to take off, and it didn't. And some self-build residents, they did build their own homes rather traditionally in that way. And the local authority didn't really support them because they didn't think it was their job. And the developer who owned the largest site, great developer, they didn't have anybody, they didn't see that as their responsibility. So these people sort of fell between the gaps, they just weren't, and these were the self-builders who were reasonably empowered and go for it. So there was no way that co-housing scheme that was going to exist on that site was ever really going to take off. And we were there for 4 years, and in that time, that site remained absolutely undeveloped. Nobody touched it. And it's just a crying shame that we just do not have this culture. We do not have that diversity. Yet you go to Europe, Berlin, Vienna, wherever you want, doesn't really matter. You'll find something interesting going on in every town, in every city, to a higher standard than here.
Rosie, I wanted to finish my final question for the panel before the floor is yours. I wanted to ask you about the 6-point strategy, because when reading that, I was just so optimistic, actually, and the guidance is so clear. So if you could talk us through that.
Okay, very simply, we'd like government to start with a greenfield last approach. And I don't know if you're familiar with the local plan process. Every local authority has to put in place a local plan for housing and, to a degree, infrastructure for, say, 15 years. At the moment, there's this awful call for sites. And if you ever look at a call for sites map, it's a sea of red. Every single developer and landowner chucks their land into the pot, and kind of the one around me at the moment that you can barely see any green space left. Doesn't mean it'll all get built on, but it's a really back to front way of doing things. So starting with high density, because it follows on from what Kevin was saying, I went out to Freiburg in Germany a few years ago to look at Vauban and Rieselfeld, which are brownfield, high density developments, walkable into the city, brilliant cycle routes, buses, trams, trains, really cheap, lots of them. And the high density developments, they're no more than 4 stories, and this is because of the shared space thing that Kevin was talking about. The theory was that a parent could be on the balcony looking out over all this amazing green space and trees and see the children playing down below and call them in for tea. And actually, how good is that? Your children have got entertainment without what happens at the moment. A lot of new builds, the new park that's built, is across the main road. And I see it again near me. You see these poor children, the mums with their buggies, trying to go across the main road to get to the new green space. With the high density, you have the green space all around you, and courtyard developments are similar as well. So density brings so many benefits. So we definitely want to see that first. And we want to see high density as a standard thing rather than sort of 30 homes per hectare we're seeing at the moment. Then it's going through the sort of things on this list, really. We want really good, rigorous, evidence-based brownfield registers, because at the moment councils have to have them, but they don't include all the brownfield that's out there. They're very sketchy, so we want those properly challenged by planning inspectors. We want to see a commercial and public property register again, and reasons for councils why they can't bring that back into use. We want to see any lodges or spare rooms available in a district counted as part of the housing numbers, because you're probably all aware the housing numbers are a massive issue for local authorities. And we want to see mandatory build-out of planning permissions within a certain time, and penalties for developers that don't do it. And I think Michael Gove is about to bring in a rule that is a sort of credibility test for developers. So if you hadn't built out a previous site or hadn't delivered your obligations, you would not be allowed to build again in that local authority area. What a great idea. Shared bedrooms. And obviously the empty homes as well, bringing empty homes back into use. All of that, it's not as good as saying to the local authorities, do it. It's the authorities must set out a list of what they've got. And then government has to step up to the plate, has to fund these things. I happened to have breakfast this morning in my B&B with the chair of a housing association in Manchester, desperate to build affordable housing, hasn't got any of the funding she needs to bring back the empty homes, the brownfield sites, and so on and so forth. So we need government to recognise that. Fun fact, 50 years ago, we spent 96% of the housing budget on building new social homes. Now we spend 88% on the housing benefit. That's money down the drain. You've got obviously the right to buy, I talked about as well, so the stock's being lost. So we need to start building social houses, and government needs to recognise it cannot solve the housing crisis by saying to the private sector, go away and solve it. So it really just all needs to be evidence-based, and greenfield the very last resort once you've exhausted all of those options on the list.
Thank you so much. Brilliant. So now the floor is yours. Do we have questions? I'm sure we do have many. So there's a question just over here.
Yeah, thank you to all the panel. That was really fascinating. I think Kevin mentioned Vienna, which has some of the best affordable housing in the world. A few years ago, they introduced a law where every new development has to be 50% green space. You have maybe 3-4 stories, again, around a courtyard or with a park in the middle, raised beds for the locals to grow vegetables, flowers, etc. I think that 50% rule, they build a lot of housing, but they have a lot of green space. Would you back something like that being introduced in the UK?
Yes. My point is generally that there's so many good examples around Europe that we don't need to think too hard how to do it here. What we need to do is to send Angela Rayner around Europe for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then I think Ed Miliband's been. So in a way, it's the small island mentality that we have, that we can't understand what is possible. And what is possible is exquisite, and it's sort of the best of what is out there. If you were to try and combine that into one scheme, one country, one place, that would be phenomenal. But it's what you describe sounds almost paradisical in that one description, that one sentence. But it occurs across all kinds of policies and all kinds of approaches to construction and to the creation of buildings and placemaking and diversity and the relationship between our environment and the natural environment. So, it's all there. It's shaming, isn't it? And I'm afraid our borders are being assaulted now by Scotland, who want to build all new homes to Passive House standards or equivalent. Wales has its Future Wellbeing of Communities Act. I get those words always in the wrong order. The Community Future Wellbeing Act. I can't remember. Just put those 3 words in: future, community, well-being. Why hasn't Westminster adopted that?
Absolutely. We have another question just over here.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I'm a chartered surveyor who works in development, so I'm capitalist bastard adjacent, I guess, at best. I'm surprised you guys didn't talk more about the planning system, because being at the cutting edge of it, it's absolutely maddening. And the reason we have my clients, who are the big key house builders, and they're the only people left standing, is because the risk of planning is so enormous. You're small, medium guys who are going to do brownfield sites and anything creative you've talked about on the panel, being inspired by Europe. It's too expensive. They can't take the risk. There's too much money up front, and that's effectively planning, which is has so many dead ends and takes so long. They just can't do it. So I'd be interested to see your views on how planning could be reformed.
Thank you. I can't see you to look at you, so apologise. I'll stare up into the lights. Oh, there's completely other place. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. The planning system, it's under-resourced. You've got planning officers, you've got far too much to do. We were talking earlier about sort of biodiversity net gain officers and what a small number of local authorities have officers. Therefore, it either slows up an application for a developer or it means that bad schemes get through. So it's bad for everyone. So I think the resourcing issue is a major, major problem. And I think the complexity as well of schemes, the amount of documentation required is a nightmare. And you've got the nationally significant infrastructure projects as well, which can reach like thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, let alone pages. So I'm not averse to simplifying the planning system. What scares me is this whole baby out with bathwater approach we seem to get from government, whereby anything in the way of development is up for grabs. So nature's in the way, so throw away all the environmental protections. Sort of, I don't know, paperwork's too high, so let's just cut paperwork. Consultations, another one they're going for at the moment, is like, let's cut consultations out because they slow things down. And, I mean, yes, consultations can be a nightmare. I've been opposing a pylon scheme in East Anglia for the last 3 years. We've been consulted 4 times, I think, now, and we've known at each stage that the National Grid will ignore us, so we have to play the game, we have to put the evidence forward, and we know eventually it gets to a planning inspector, eventually gets to Secretary of State, eventually a judge. So we need to play the game like they are, but they're meaningless consultations. So what we need is better consultations early on everything, local plans, planning applications, I guess, as well, infrastructure, so that people actually have a say in their future rather than being faced with something that's a done deal when it's presented to them that they can't change, because that's where you get the objectors from. So, I mean, I object to stuff because it's so terrible what's put in front of me. And each time I've objected to things, I've said there's a really good way of doing this that would meet your same goals and be a better way and be more popular. So it's kind of, going back to your question, yes, I do think there are major problems with the planning system. I think a lot of that is resourcing, and it could be helped with more staff.
Before we move to the question over there, we're just going to throw to...
Well, I think actually Chris may have a view about specifically the biodiversity net gain issues and through the planning process. But I just want to say very quickly that I pursued Michael Gove over something which is in the 2008 Climate Act. And the thing that actually underscores the activities of the CCC in the UK, and which the government now chooses to ignore. And despite this government declaring a climate crisis in 2019 in Parliament, there was an absolute view, for the certainly until very, very recently, that if a local authority wanted to create a local plan in which they prescribed higher standards for building performance, that's for energy use, and for so many other aspects of a scheme in terms of, biodiversity, so forth, architectural quality, diversity of offer, that if it wanted to do that above and beyond national legislation, it could not do that. Michael Gove repeatedly ruled to that effect. And then last year, the Conservative government reiterated that formally. And then this year, one local authority, in particular, Lancaster, who'd been fighting and had their local plan thrown out by the planning inspectorate, won on appeal. So it's a game-changing ruling that means that local authority, and there are others too around the country, Cambridge, West Oxfordshire, Cornwall, there's Cotswolds, for example. These are local authorities that have the resources and the energy and the support and the mandate from their electorate to drive forward really, really demanding local plans. Now, it's not perfect, but they are going above and beyond what national government sets. So you're seeing a revolution happen within planning from those local authorities which are well-resourced, leaving those local authorities that are not and that are a bit worried about this, who don't want to commit £4 million because they haven't got it, to developing a really adventurous local plan. So we're going to end up with a multi-speed UK, where the regions, Scotland, Wales, and some of these local authorities are driving quality, are driving exemplars. And again, I say it's not going to be perfect, but it demonstrates a pushing and an atomization, a devolution of control over planning to these places. They're going to attract the best planners, by the way, which is only going to add to the distinction between those places that are doing well and those that don't. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the case with biodiversity, whether you feel that, Chris.
I feel if they...
That was the win, by the way, that I mentioned earlier. And
Sorry, I forgot to answer your question.
That's fine.
I think if the government are able to... Is it on? Yeah. Right. I think if the government are able to drive the planning and infrastructure bill through with Part 3 intact, and given that the environmental NGOs tabled a load of amendments this week and every single one of them are thrown out, they seem determined to do that, then we're in deep, deep trouble. Yep. I mean, if you go to the government website, I've got it written in front of me here, it says that the introduction of this bill will not undermine or harm any existing environmental legislation that we have. But the Office of Environmental Protection and my lawyers have been through that legislation, and there is, without ambiguity, that's what it will do. So it will strip away the environmental protection that we fought long and hard to have to protect that biodiversity if it goes through as it is. And that's something that's extremely worrying. Angela stood up and said that it wouldn't do so. And then on May the 9th, myself and Ruth and Bob basically sent her a pre-action protocol letter. So we're taking her to court because she is misinforming MPs by telling them when they have to vote upon this that legislation won't be damaging to the environment, when the Office of Environmental Protection, us, all of them, Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust, OSPBS, have clearly identified that it will. So if that bill goes through, we're in deep trouble. And frankly, you need to get your chains out, because you will need to be tying yourself to trees, and you will be needing to sit down in front of bulldozers, because frankly, that's the only way we're going to stop it. We're going to have to stand up for those newts and bats and the arachnids, don't forget them. And we'll have to do that at community level. And again, why this government thinks that there aren't people in this room or sat on this stage that won't do that, I honestly don't know. We love life. Home is where our heart is. We will protect the life in our homes. Kia, read it.
Absolutely, thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I know there are a few hands waving, but we've just got one over there with the lady with the paddle. So if you could just...
Thank you.
That be very brief.
Chris has just partly answered my question, actually. It's been really interesting, and thank you for everything all of you are doing in this space. But most of what you've said has just made me really, really angry. So what can we do other than chaining ourselves to oak trees? Are there petitions we can sign? I guess we should be supporting the charities that are taking this action. So let us know what we can do as members of the public.
And just before we answer that, I'm just going to ask the question, what can we do? A really important question, and actually my final one. And it's going to be the final question over there. I just wanted to hear what both of those were, so we could maybe try and wrap up together.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's related to the last two conversations, and speaking as a professional tree hugger, if you like. This planning and infrastructure bill, it's a bill. It's currently a bill, so it's not law yet. So there are things we can do. I've written to my MP about 4 times about it, because the Section 3 that Chris has mentioned is being portrayed by the government as a win-win. It's far from that, and the government have consulted on that, but they've not listened to the response. They've just marched ahead, and they haven't considered the impact of it properly. And I understand there's no impact, there's no appetite at the very top of government to change it. So it's incredibly important that people in this room do something. One of the things you could do is write to your MP, but I'd be interested to hear from Chris and other members of the panel what else people could do. But because it's happening at the moment, please everyone go and write to their MP as soon as you get home, because there's still time to change it.
Thank you very much. So we will end on that. So some closing thoughts about what we can all do. Thank you.
Okay, the first thing is that you can write to your MP, but cast your mind back to the first piece of legislation that was put before this government, and that was the Climate and Nature Bill, and they whipped them to vote against it. So they could, even if you write all the letters that you can possibly summon, just instruct all of their MPs to vote that bill through. It's primary legislation, so therefore at this point in time, we can't do anything legally. Where you could put a spanner in the works is in the House of Lords, because as the bill is still at the committee stage, it will go ricocheting back and forth between the Lords and the Commons. And we do have supportive Lords. So aside from the MPs, make sure you put your fingers onto the keypad and send letters to those who are supportive in that regard. And then the other thing is that, I think you say, what can we do apart from chain ourselves to trees? Another piece of court action that I've instigated this week is against the police crime sentencing and courts bill. We have the democratic right to peaceful protest in this country. It's something that we must uphold. You don't have to sit in the road. You don't need to get arrested. You simply need to shout above the noise in order to make a difference. And I think that this is a time when we will have to do that. We're looking at a climate breakdown and global biodiversity loss, which threatens us, our species, and the one and only planet that we know of in the universe where there's complex life. Do we want it on our consciences that we destroy that? I don't think so. This is the point where you really have to make a difference, and that means getting involved and getting engaged. Rosie, how can they do that?
Let's take that, I don't need it. I completely agree. So if you look at homesforeveryone.org, every single one of you can click on that right now, and there's an email there you can send to MPs. It talks about how bad the planning bill is. If you sent it before, do it again. I know about 13,000 people sent it before Christmas, but just keep sending emails. Send it to your friends and ask them to send it. If you've got a Labour MP, go and meet them, talk to them, make sure they listen to you. They are being told, as Chris said, that this is a brilliant bill, it's all about nature restoration. They genuinely believe that, not necessarily their fault if they haven't read it, but they need to understand that part 3, that restoration section, is an absolute shocker for nature. So if you've got a Labour MP, we massively need your help, because they will be whipped, but we need them to make noise. And a bit separate, if you've got reform people locally, talk to them, because they will put the pressure on Labour as well. So send that round to everyone you know and ask them to send the email. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, did you want to have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, these guys have sort of evinced it so fully, really. I just add one thing, and that is there are other channels and there are other things to do. I mean, it's slightly peripheral, but every local authority has to have a register of land available for construction and for self-build and for community self-build and for custom build. And if you're interested in that, they also have to keep a register of interested parties, residents, people, groups of people coming together in order to build a co-housing scheme. So the roots are there if you want to engage with them. But there's one thing that I hadn't said, which I think is really, really, it goes right back to the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about numbers. And there is an obsession in our society with quantity, not quality. And and governments of all organisations are fallible to this. You know, everybody talks about delivering the numbers. This is about quality of place, about quality of offer, about quality of choice for us, quality of diversity and biodiversity in our world. And if we get that right, and again, I come back to the fact that across Europe, there are examples of people getting this right. If we get that right, then we change the mindset here, away from the numbers. There is nobody in the government championing quality.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant panel. Rosie, Chris, and Kevin. Thank you so much for being here.